It's a real pleasure to welcome Manuel Pastor, who's written a number of books. This is the most recent, and it's called State of Resistance: What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Mean for America's Future. It's a great read. It's not only filled with very interesting information, but it's very well written. He was a double minor for his bachelor's degree in creative writing and economics, and he may be the only economics guy I've ever met who can make things interesting. But it really is a great book, and he will be willing to sign some after the talk tonight. Dr. Pastor is a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California, where he also serves as director of the program for environmental and regional equity. And he's co-director of USC's Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. He currently holds the Turpanjian Chair in Civil Society and Social Change at USC. He got his PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He also got his master's degree there. He got his bachelor's degree at UC Santa Cruz. In 2012, he received the Wally Marks Changemaker of the Year Award from the Liberty Hill Foundation for his research partnerships with social justice organizations. He's the author, as I said, of a number of books, countless papers. Some of his books included Unsettled Americans, Metropolitan Context, and Civic Leadership for Immigrant Integration, which was co-edited with John Malenkov. And he wrote Equity, Growth, and Community: What the Nation Can Learn from America's Metro Areas, which was co-authored with Chris Benner. There's a remarkable list of scholarly accomplishments and also public service. And as he was telling me earlier, it's through the public service that he's gotten much of the material for his scholarly work. He's doing many things that we're very interested in here and that are relevant to our Aquatic Academy. And so please join me in welcoming Manuel Pastor.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to stand here. I like to wander around when I talk. I want to thank you for that kind introduction. I usually tell people that they should just say that I've been married for 35 years, which shows a certain level of determination and stick-to-itiveness. Another little bit of determination to let you know is I was really glad that you invited me. I'm so glad that I'm here. And actually, just yesterday, I was in DC for a meeting, and I stayed late because my son's band was performing. So I had to get up this morning at 4:15 on East Coast time, which is 1:15 this time, fly to the West Coast. I actually had to work in the plane the whole time, and then go down to Orange County and give a speech, and then come back up here for this one. So Jerry, I like you. That's evidence of this. So let me talk a little bit about the book, and I like to let people know that when I'm talking, if my voice breaks or tires a little bit, it may be because of all that travel, but it's also because I have a speech condition that's called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box. Diane Rehm on NPR had it, now me. And I always like to let people know too that it gets, and this is true, it gets treated once a month with Botox. Which is, let's just say, refreshing. So, you might think that a book with a title, State of Resistance, was prompted by an election. And you'd be right. But not by the election you think. We actually started writing this book in 2016, before the results of the November election of that year. And it was prompted actually by the Obama election in 2008. Because what I took away was that when Obama got elected, a lot of people who wanted to change public policy in which they thought, in what they thought was a more progressive or positive direction, sort of rushed Washington thinking that policy change happened there. When instead what they should have done is go back to communities and do the kind of community organizing, social movement mobilization that would have provided wind to Obama's sails when he was right, for example, in my opinion, around expanding healthcare, or held him accountable when he was wrong, for example, when he made a play about really stepping up deportations, hoping that that would attract some share of the Republican Party into a bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform deal. And into that vacuum, I mean, because many of you know that the Obama campaign in 2008 had something called Obama for America, which was kind of organizing at a grassroots level. Into that relative vacuum stepped the Tea Party. And the Tea Party might have been astroturfed in by Koch brothers dollars, but it actually was speaking to some real grassroots rage and upsetness that was there. And it seemed to me in 2016 that we were sort of likely, for folks on my sort of side of the equation, to make exactly the same mistake. I think most of you thought, no matter what your political persuasion, that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And I thought, well, everybody's going to go to DC, keep thinking that's really where change takes place. They're not going to realize that unless you change the political calculus on the ground, you really can't change policy. And then in the 8 years of the Obama presidency, 900 seats at state legislatures and state senates actually passed from Democratic hands to Republican hands because of who was paying attention to state level organizing. And then, of course, the election happened. And I still remember the day after the election. I walked back into the office with a little bit of a hangover. And we have a staff that's pretty millennial, pretty young. They were pretty crestfallen by the results. And I walked in and they were looking to me for, inspiration. And so I stepped up to the plate and said, I think it's going to be worse than you think. Which is probably one of the few times an economist has been right about a prediction, right? So first I realized that was not inspiring. And then I also realized that there was something that someone in my position would be able to do, and that's to build on the fact that in many ways, the United States in 2016 was passing, still is passing, through its Prop 187 moment. You'll recall that in California in the early 1990s, 94 in particular, we passed overwhelmingly Prop 187, which was a proposition that was designed to strip social services, including educational services, from undocumented immigrants in the state. Tremendous anxiety around immigration and demographic change. But what people forget about California in the early 1990s was it wasn't just concern about immigration. In the early 1990s, California suffered nearly half of the country's net job losses of that recession, because the recession in the early 1990s was driven by a cutback in defense spending that really nailed our aerospace industry, particularly in Southern California. That kind of kicked the props away from the rest of our industrial structure. So we suffered tremendous economic devastation. And what people forget is that Rush Limbaugh began his talk radio career in the late 1980s in Sacramento. So that sort of perfect combination of demographic anxiety, economic uncertainty, and profiteering from political polarization, we did it first. And 25 or so years later, California is one of the first two states to raise its wage, minimum wage, to $15 an hour. It's a state which declared itself a sanctuary state, that has said it would not cooperate with immigration and customs enforcement, local sheriffs, and police under a piece of legislation called the California Values Act. That's pretty dramatic. It's a state which, after leading the nation in incarceration between 1980 and 2008, the countries outside of California, the rest of the country, the incarcerated population rose fourfold. It rose by sixfold in California. After leading the nation in incarceration, we're now leading the nation in de-incarceration. And obviously, one thing very relevant to the Aquarium is that it's a state which is also leading on the issue of addressing climate change, has set some pretty remarkable goals with regard to renewable energy, launched one of the first, eventually I think the Northeast will get it to New England, but a cap and trade system to try to manage greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera. So it's a really interesting question. How did California go from the days of the early 1990s to where it is right now? And a kind of related question is, what can we learn from that to speed up the process in the rest of the country? So that's what the book's about. And let me tell you a little bit about kind of the story that's in the book. And I'll do this in sort of a short fashion, partly because of the time limits, but also so that you actually buy the book instead of thinking that, by listening to me that you will have captured the whole thing. So what we try to do, is to try to tell the story of California by asking first, when did California work? Kind of what went wrong? And what led to the change, or the arc of change, that we've seen in the state in the last 25 or so years. So to kind of get to the question of when the state worked, we sort of harken back to the 50s and 60s, an era that was imperfect. There was plenty of racial discrimination in housing. You saw it very much here in Long Beach. Plenty of racial discrimination in terms of labor markets as well, but yet there was a kind of sense of optimism of things changing and things moving forward. My family moved from New York to California in 1957. I was 6 months old. We moved here, we were in New York, because my sister had asthma, and the doctor said that moving to Los Angeles would be good for your asthma. This was back in the era in which doctors were recommending filter cigarettes as a way to kind of toughen your lungs for the future, right? So, but there was a kind of sense of optimism in the state. And that optimism in the state, I would argue, was driven by the fact, kind of three big buckets of things, the kinds of investments we were making, the kind of economy we had, and the kind of social compact that governed the state. The kind of investments were, we were making lots of investments in expanding transportation and water, so roads and water. No longer the kind of investments we want to make now, but we were making investments then that were about the infrastructure of the state. We were building housing, building lots of housing. A lot of it was suburban housing, a kind of sprawl that we want to see changed right now, but we were building housing for people who would come to the state. And we had a remarkable investment in human capital. In the 1960s, we were among the top 10 states in terms of our per student spending on K through 12 education. And we also had the master plan, which was put in place by Pat Brown, but it was an agreement to articulate our community college, state university, and UC systems. And that higher education system was virtually free. I mean, I went to UC Santa Cruz. I was attracted, of course, because there were no grades. Because it was like that kind of hippie era, it was really a great place to be. But it was virtually free to go there. I think I came out with like $200 worth of debt. It was a great, imagine that these days, right? So it was kind of an amazing set of investments that were being made. And all of that was being done in a context of two other things that were really important. One was an economy that was growing jobs in the middle. So it was growing jobs where working class people could attain middle class lifestyles based on the jobs that were there, the unions that kept those wages high, and the kind of industries that we had. The other thing that it was held together by was a kind of social compact. And the social compact in California was a kind of sense of mutual obligation about welcoming newcomers and investing in the generation growing up here. We begin chapter 2 of the book with an op-ed from the early 1990s by a professor who's at UCLA, David Hayes Batista. By this way, this shows you what a tremendous bridge builder I am, that I would quote someone from UCLA, right? So, but David Hayes Batista had this great article in op-ed in the LA Times, and he said, I don't know what we're going to do. We've got this new population coming in. Their level of education is very low. Their families are really big. They live in overcrowded housing. How are they ever going to fit into a modern economy? And of course, everybody thought he was talking about the wave of Mexican and Central American migrants. And he says, of course, I'm talking about the Okies who arrived in the 30s and 40s. And we figured out how to make the investments to integrate them. There was an interesting bipartisan social compact in the state. I mean, Pat Brown was a great governor, but he was building on the work that Earl Warren had already put in place with infrastructure, et cetera. So there was this kind of sense that the state was supposed to welcome newcomers and was supposed to invest in the next generation. So that's kind of like the story of when, in some ways, again, with imperfections, California worked. The question we asked then is what went wrong and what turned things around. And I want to say that the simple answer for California, and it's a kind of warning sign for the rest of the country, is that what went wrong was the way in which race and racism got the better of Californians. So as demographic change started to happen in California, we began to see some very interesting changes. And the first sign of this is actually, how many of you heard of Prop 13? Okay, so you've all heard of that. How many of you heard of Prop 14? So Prop 14 is a very interesting proposition. Passes in 1964. It passes on the heel of fair housing legislation that was put in place by one of the first African-American state senators who came from the Bay Area, Oakland. And it was fair housing legislation that eliminated racially restrictive real estate practices. And in redlining, et cetera. And so what happened was that in 1964, on the ballot was a proposition that said, you know what, in the name of private property, you should be able to do with your property whatever you want, so you should be able to discriminate and not sell. And that passed overwhelmingly in the state. It was championed by Ronald Reagan as a symbol of private property rights, and he wound up then running a campaign in 1966 to become governor by attacking Pat Brown for supporting fair housing and celebrating his support for Prop 14. It's interesting. And what happened is that Prop 14 actually got struck down in 1966 as well, because when it went to the Supreme Court looked at it and said, what exactly were you thinking here, right? That you could pass legislation basically putting back in place racially, what part of the 14th Amendment do you not understand, right? So, but, Reagan won with that. Turned out to be a more moderate governor than people kind of remember, but it was a big sea change in the state, and it's the same people who fought for Prop 14, who fought against busing in the early 1970s, who became some of the biggest proponents of the more famous legislation, Prop 13. So Prop 13, as many of you know, I'm looking at an older audience, so you're informed. So for the one or two young people in the audience, what Prop 13 did in the 1970s, housing prices were going up dramatically. people's property tax assessments are going up dramatically, particularly difficult circumstances for low-income seniors on a fixed income. That was a problem that could have been fixed with a scalpel, but it was instead fixed with a sledgehammer. And what it did, Prop 13, was roll back property tax assessments to their 1975 levels, say that nobody could tax more than 1% of that property tax level, and you couldn't increase the property tax assessment by more than 2% a year, no matter what was happening in the market. In many ways, it was a declaration of generational warfare. Because what it said was that if you were, and it was mostly an older, whiter homeowner class, your property tax assessments were protected. If you were a younger, more diverse, new set of homeowners, you'd be paying full freight. I'll give you an example in a minute. And it would starve the state exactly as new kids were arriving into the school system. It is interesting that the 1970s is the decade in California in which the share of children who were children of color grew by more than ever in California history or since. Just as a new generation was changing demographically, comes this thing that starves the state. This thing about new homeowners paying full freight. So we bought a house. I came to work at USC in 2007. So we bought a house in 2007 because that's how economists roll. We like to get right there and buy a property before a financial crash. Fortunately, it's Pasadena, so it's going to come back up in value. But yes, don't follow what economists do. So anyway, we pay like $10,000 or $11,000 in property taxes. Across the street, there was a property, one bedroom smaller than ours, that was paying $600 a year in property taxes. Older owner. At this point, they were actually just renting it. So that property has now changed hands just a couple of years ago. New young woman who moved in across the street, Nigerian-American lawyer, next change, next demographic. She's now paying $7,000 a year in property taxes. So think about the generational dimensions of this, right, that I'm talking about. So Prop 13 passes, and Ronald Reagan writes that to the presidency in 1980. Because he said, look, we cut taxes in California. We should cut taxes at a federal level. That's what happens. The federal government winds up being fiscally starved too. So by the 1990s, the kind of what were like racial undertones or like dog whistle politics became racial overtones and full bullhorn politics, right? In the 1990s is an era that political scientist Daniel Hosang calls the era of the racial propositions. Prop 187, the elimination of bilingual education, the elimination of affirmative action, 3 strikes laws, the decision to try juveniles as adults, all of this very clearly targeted at Black and Latino youth. So that's a very difficult time for people who might care about social justice issues. The question is, how did we go from that? And interestingly, what I would argue, and this is really kind of echoes of today, at the moment in which California was finding its industrial structure just kicked out from beneath it, and we should have been paying attention to what do we need to do to recover the economy? How do we generate an economy that grows jobs in the middle? How do we sustain industry and employment growth and middle-class lifestyles? Just as we should have been having that conversation, we were instead talking about immigrants taking jobs, African Americans getting advantage from affirmative action, and sort of thinking about these communities of color as criminals rather than contributors. Echoes of today? So, question is kind of what turned things around? And what we try to do in the book is to argue that what turned things around is a series of demographic, economic, political factors that some people have paid some attention to. I think we lift up some new things. But mostly what we lift up is a shift in the way that people did community organizing and civic engagement that we think is absolutely crucial, and it's kind of the key part of the book. So let me start with those other things first. So first, the state continued to change demographically, and it had a couple of impacts. It created the possibility for electoral change, because its demography is changing, there could be electoral change. But I want to remind you that demography is not destiny, because Texas is on the same demographic path, right? But its politics have not changed in the way that California's did. I actually think that what was more important was that as demographic change took place, a couple things resulted, which is that people just kind of got used to it and began to see some of it as an asset. There's an interesting thing in the United States right now. Not one for one, but mostly. The places that are really concerned about immigrants don't have any, right? Think about it. The big reaction is in the Midwest. They need immigrants to be able to fill jobs and grow the economy there. And in fact, forward-looking cities like Dayton, Ohio are trying to attract immigrants to them to start businesses, revive their downtowns, et cetera. A lot of the places that are freaked out, I mean, if you think about West Virginia, I cannot imagine a Mexican immigrant going, hey, I want to be in coal mining right now. That looks like a forward-looking industry, right? So, but in California, the demographic change took place, and a couple of things happened, is that people kind of got used to it, began to realize it's not as disconcerting as you might think. And I think that that's an important thing that took place. Second thing was economic. And here I want to talk about the political consequences of the economic change. We talk a little bit more about economy in the Q&A. Two things happened economically that were significant. The first was that California, partly because of the deindustrialization, partly because of immigration, partly because of the shifts in the service industry, began to become a capital of working poverty. That is, people who actually worked but still fell below the poverty line. Now that's an economic problem, but the interesting thing about it is in the United States, we don't have a lot of sympathy for people who are poor. Yes?
What was the term you used? Capital something?
The capital of working poverty, of people who have full-time year-round jobs but still fall below the poverty line. And whether we like it or not, if you feel differently about this politically, people in the United States do not have a lot of sympathy for people who are poor but are not working. Maybe we should, I would think it's a good thing if we did, but we have a lot of sympathy for people who are working full-time and still can't make it. We know there must be something wrong with the system and not with them. So that allowed the state, as early as the 1980s, to raise its minimum wage. It allowed all these campaigns for living wage, community benefits agreements, a bunch of different things built around working poverty. Second thing that happened, which is kind of interesting, was a geographic shift in the center of economic power. So Southern California business kind of collapsed. And along with that went almost all of the Fortune 500 companies. Meanwhile, the Bay Area kind of recovered from the early 1990s more rapidly. They were actually hard hit as well by the cutback in defense spending because there used to be a place that manufactured a lot of chips and other things for defense. But they were able to recover partly through a lot of business leadership groups that learned to collaborate together. And partly what that meant was Bay Area capital has always been more liberal than Southern California business. More open to immigrants, more open to diversity, more open to environmental protection. That's changed in Southern California, but we used to have a very conservative business class relative to the Bay Area. So that changed. The other thing that changed was politics, and I want to lift up one part of politics that made a difference. Something that a lot of people didn't think a lot about, which was term limits. Term limits were had their problems because you had a situation where a lot of people were looking at what their next job would be, and they wouldn't necessarily acquire a lot of experience. But there's no way that Karen Bass, a community organizer from South Los Angeles, could have risen so rapidly to become the first African-American female head of a state legislature anywhere in the United States without term limits. And there's no way that Kevin De Leon, who cut his teeth as a community organizer fighting against Prop 187, could have become President pro tem of the Senate and presided over the renewal of the commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, over the California Values Act, over raising the minimum wage, et cetera. So term limits kind of cleared a path for new leadership, which would not have been possible without this last piece that I'll spend the most amount of time on and then come to a close for questions. And that is that there was a big shift in what you might think of as community organizing and social movement mobilization. So let me tell you a little bit about that. So we devote a whole chapter of this in the book to kind of what happened. And I'm going to do this in a very shorthand way. But I think a couple of things were really key. So first, and you can be anywhere you are politically, probably would be good to think about, you know, let me just do this first. You know, after the Goldwater landslide in 1964, Republicans kind of got tired of losing that badly and began to figure out how do you mobilize and organize in different ways, and that's led to the transformation of states like Kansas. What happened in the 1990s in California is that progressives got tired of losing. People who are on the left are often quite proud when they lose, right? Like, I had a lot of values, I fought with a lot of integrity, and I lost. There's not that much glory in losing, particularly when you lose and immigrant lives are at threat, you lose and incarceration rates skyrocket, you lose and bilingual education, which worked very well for some kids, gets completely eliminated as an option at all within the schools. You lose and affirmative action, which is a big reason why I went to UC Santa Cruz, affirmative action to take a chance on a kid like me that did not fit the typical profile, gets eliminated. So people who were community organizers got tired of losing and wanted to figure out how to win. And it turned out that one of the secrets to winning was actually changing the electorate. And the way to change the electorate is to engage in something that's now called integrated voter engagement. What is integrated voter engagement? Normally when people talk about elections, they talk about get out the vote. What that means is when the election comes around, you try to find the people you know are going to vote for you, and you get them out to vote. That doesn't change the electorate, it just amplifies your side. And if someone else is amplifying their side, you've just raised the stakes, but not the margin. Does that make sense? So what integrated voter engagement is about is to say, who doesn't vote? Who is the new and occasional voter who we can get out to change the electorate? So, and how do you do that? You do that by coupling community organizing techniques with electoral politics. So people began to experiment with the idea of talking to people for years before an election, trying to turn out new and occasional voters, and then when people engage in voting, which is a legitimate civic activity, to try to say, now that you've engaged that way, why don't you come to a city council meeting? Why don't you come to a march or protest? Why don't you come to a board or commission and make your voice heard? So, integrated voter engagement. And you may or may not know this, but there's a project in the state of California called the Million Voters Project, which is run by a group called California Calls and a few other groups. They're on their way to being able to mobilize 1 million voters in 2020. In 2016, they now can mobilize between 500,000 and 750,000 new and occasional voters. And these are people who can really change an election and change almost any ballot proposition. That's the margin you need in the state of California. It's the reason why Prop 47 which defelonized drug use and helped to reduce a lot of felonies on people's records so that they could then re-enter, have those expunged and re-enter more successfully. That was actually put on the ballot in 2014 and won in an off year. You shouldn't be able to win a ballot measure like that in a non-presidential year when you don't have that many young voters and minority voters, but they put it on because they knew they could mobilize enough people to make sure it could win. So integrated voter engagement. The second big thing was learning to change the narrative. And changing the narrative meant not sort of moving to the middle, but figuring out how you move the middle. So, for example, you could get into a debate about, and people do, about the minimum wage, should you hike it or not. But when you start talking about a living wage, what's on the other side? I'd like a non-living wage. When you talk about a community benefits agreement, what are you saying? You don't want community benefits? You change the narrative. When you start talking about dreamers, who are undocumented immigrants who came to the country at an early age, grew up in the United States, they wrapped themselves up in the dream, the American dream, you're moving the middle. When you fight for, instead of civil unions for LGBTQ couples, you fight for marriage equality because everyone has the right to form families and love who they want. That's moving the middle. So big rhetorical shift to trying to move the middle rather than moving to the middle. Part of that, by the way, is also getting people who are progressive to think about what really moves the middle. So that group I was telling you about, California Calls, getting people out there in the community to change minds, first thing they tell their organizers, don't wear Che Guevara t-shirts, right? Because you're only going to move people then who are already there with you. Does that make sense? Wear Che Guevara t-shirts, wear instead like polo shirts, like your polo shirt. Looks very, and you have an I voted thing on it too. So, so how do you really engage normal people who are not political? And that gets to the third big lesson that I think is key to California. I'll apply it to contemporary United States, and then we'll open up for Q&A. And it comes from the following insight. There is not one more liberal vote that you're going to get out of Berkeley. If there's a conservative person in Berkeley, that person is determined and resistant to every social norm around them, right? About what it means to be a Berkeleyite, right? The way that you change the state is not by running and talking to everybody you already know. It's about running in those parts of the state that are not already convinced. And so there was the development of what was called the Fishhook strategy, Orange County through San Diego, up to the Inland Empire and into the Central Valley. And the idea was to try to create organizations that could mobilize voters and mobilize community engagement and civic engagement in these places that are more the purple parts of the state. So it doesn't mean giving up the anchor organizations that might be in the LA and the Bay Area, but how do you actually talk to people in the Central Valley, talk to people in Orange County, San Diego, Inland Empire, et cetera. And that idea of running everywhere is one of the reasons why in this last midterm election, Orange County turned totally blue, which is the first time that's happened since the dawn of man. So, one thing for you to realize is that those three big lessons, change the electorate, move the middle, run everywhere, that's the Pay to Our Work campaign in Texas, right? They changed the electorate by engaging new and occasional voters. O'Rourke, and I'm not pitching a particular candidate, I'm being analytical here, like his breakout moment was defending the right of NFL players to protest by not standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. And what that, the national anthem, what that sort of did was to say, look, I'm going to try to move the middle. I'm not going to move to the middle. I'm going to try to move the middle and say, here's where I'm at. You can have it. He actually started that rap by saying, I understand if you've got a different opinion. It's a perfectly legitimate opinion. Here's mine. And they ran everywhere. They ran everywhere. It's what Stacey Abrams did in Georgia, and probably if the votes had been counted, she would have won. It's what Andrew Gillum did in Florida, change the electorate, move the middle, run everywhere. None of those three won, but all of them came a lot closer than anybody gave them a shot at doing in those very tough terrains, and they had big coattails that really changed things for other seats. So what we try to do at the end of the book is to lift up what some of these lessons might mean for America right now. I do want to say that we are not Pollyannish, because California, while it may pride itself on its political turn, still has not delivered on what that political turn promises. This is a state that's now got the fourth highest level of income inequality of any state in the United States. We are more unequal, believe it or not, than Alabama and Mississippi, places we've always looked to as beacons of social justice and economic opportunity. We have the highest level of poverty once you control for housing costs. We're still in the bottom 10 of states in terms of our spending per capita on K through 12 education. But there's a tremendous sense of optimism in the state that what we've done is begin to understand that we need to invest in one another, that we can't let racism be a distraction from the problems that we need to face as a state, and that we're queued up to experiment with economically, how can we simultaneously lift the bottom, grow the middle, and come up with new industries that drive us forward. How do we successfully manage innovation and inclusion? So I'm optimistic about what California is going to be kind of queued up to do in the next couple of decades. And I think it's important that California get it right, because the rest of the country really is looking at what we did wrong, and they seem to be eagerly imitating it. And others are looking at what we started to do right, and we'll be trying to imitate that. So that's the book in a nutshell. Still means you should buy it. For those of you who are not big readers, there is an audible.com that you can download. And for those of you who don't even want to do that, it's about to be made into a major motion picture in which I'll be portrayed by Antonio Banderas. And if you believe any of that, there's a sucker born every minute. So thank you very much. So.
Manuel, thank you for a great lecture. Who has the first question? I'll bring the microphone since people watching remotely won't be able to hear your question. Who has the first one?
You talked about the wage inequality as being a major issue, and that seems to be getting much worse with the loss of the middle class in California, who are moving to lower cost states. So what's your take or opinion on how California addresses that?
Well, there's a great question, and I think it's got a couple of different answers to it. So first, a little bit of context. The wage inequality returns for people who are at the kind of upper end of the wage distribution, those have gone up over the last 30 years. For those at the bottom, it's actually gone down. For those in the middle, it's a little bit down, it's kind of flatlined. But, and our kind of wage inequality change has been steeper than for the rest of the country. It's been kind of on steroids. A couple things about that that I think are really key. Three things that I'm going to mention. The first is you need to contextualize one part about this, which is that worker productivity in California has gone up since 1979 by 90%, as real wages at the middle have stagnated. So we should be worried about the inequality. We also have to be worried about what's just kind of happening in the middle more generally, and how do people get a bigger share of the productivity increase. Second is we need to own up to something that we need to think about differently in the way we do economic policy. And that's the following. We pride ourselves on being an innovation economy, high tech in the Bay Area, biotech just a little bit south of you here in Orange County, and in San Diego, entertainment industry in Los Angeles. What we forget is that behind every software engineer or biotech engineer is an army of nannies and gardeners and food service workers, because those two labors go together. And we need to own up to the fact that we've got to figure out how to prop up wages at the bottom, because that's an important part of the complementary stuff that's happening at the top. Another thing that we have to own up to, which is fascinating, when you hear the words demographic change, what do you think of? Immigration, births, changing complexion and ethnic character of the country, right? We'll get to that. Because first, immigration in the United States is slowing down. Net migration from Mexico is negative. There's more Mexicans returning to Mexico than coming to the United States. The influx now is of Central Americans showing up asking for asylum. And interestingly, demographic change has really slowed down in California. The only large metropolitan area in the United States that in the last 10 years did not see an increase in the number of Hispanic children, LA. Because our immigrants are long settled, Latinos are much more US born, family formation patterns are getting closer to the US replacement norms, right? And it's expensive, so people move out, which is part of what you were saying. But we're not going to get a lot of demographic change that way. The big demographic change is that in 2010, 11% of the California population was 65 years old or older. In 2060, that number will be 26%. So the big thing is that we're aging. Right, it's going to go from 11% in 2010 to 26% in 2060. So the big thing is that we're aging, and you'd better hope there's some immigrants coming in, right? And you'd better hope that we're investing in the next generation. So more specifically in terms of policy, what do I think this means? I think that this means early childhood education. I think it means significant investment in the community college system, because that's the place where people can retrain for a changing labor market. And it's a place where a lot of our young immigrant kids and kids of color are kind of getting their first jump into either the four-year situation or directly into the labor market. It means that when we think about industry promotion, we should be asking, for example, are we promoting advanced manufacturing that's got some path for middle-wage skilled people, middle-skilled people to move into the middle class? We obviously need to do something about housing, which is in my mind a combination of building more housing, building more affordable housing, temporary rent controls where they're relevant, but beginning to really address the housing crisis. So I think there's a lot of policy that we can do, but we really need to first come together as a state.
With California being such an big agricultural state, in fact, the agricultural state, do you see any hope for a dialogue about guest worker programs, a Becerra program type? Bring it above out of the shadows.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to be hopeful about that. And I think that, so seriously, in my mind, I think we will get some form of, everybody who's thought about this thinks that comprehensive immigration reform has three elements to it. One is legalization. Most of us prefer a path to citizenship for undocumented residents who've been here. Because one thing people don't realize and forget about is that since the undocumented population in the United States has actually fallen since 2007 and been stable, it literally means people have just been here a longer time. So for example, nearly 2/3 of undocumented immigrants in California have been here for longer than a decade. They have families, they're deeply enmeshed in businesses, et cetera. I've paid taxes. In fact, they pay $6 billion a year into Social Security that they never receive. So those of you on Social Security, welcome to your undocumented immigrant contributors. So the thing about this is that most people believe that we're going to have some kind of comprehensive immigration reform that would include some legalization of the undocumented, some shifts and improvements in workplace verification, because the technology is going to be there, and then some way to have labor flows in the future. Combination of higher legal immigration and consideration of some kind of guest worker program for people who want to come in. Because
It's kind of seasonal work in a way.
well, yeah, and also not everybody wants to live here, believe it or not, right? You have to be in a place, and that's one of the reasons why net migration from Mexico is negative. Mexicans would like to live in Mexico. Now that the economy's kind of working a little bit better and there's jobs there, they're not as interested in coming here. But farmers are interested in having them here for the following reason. So we have a term we use which I think is really bad. We talk about low-skill work. I mean, anybody ever go try to pick some strawberries? Like, that requires a lot of skill. And it's not just that it's hard work, it actually requires skill. And farmers become very reliant on a particular set of things. So I've been banishing the word low skill and high skill. I've been talking about low wage and high wage work. It's kind of like just how we reward it, because there's like lots of skills going to it. So the problem is the following thing. That was actually all of the elements of the 2013 Comprehensive Immigration Reform bill that passed the Senate overwhelmingly and was bottled up in the House. And there was another part of that bill which is really interesting. That bill was so fiscally positive because of the taxes that immigrants pay, the boom that it would cause to the economy, et cetera, that it was rated so fiscally positive by the Congressional Budget Office that at the last minute, they took out $45 billion and set it aside for border security, which would have built a wall. Right? It's fascinating. So what I've been telling all my Republican friends, because they're so resistant, at least at a national level, California Republicans not so much, about comprehensive immigration reform, that if you wait for 2022, when there's a Democratic president, there's been redistricting after demographic change, and you've got an overwhelmingly Democratic House and Senate deciding this, you're never going to get a comprehensive immigration reform as stingy as the one in 2013. It's going to be a lot more lax about who could get legalization and citizenship status. There probably won't be a guest worker program because a lot of people in the immigrant rights community don't like it. So make a deal now, it's your best chance.
You mentioned several initiatives, and you spoke of them in a very positive way, but there are also very non-positive things about governing by ballot initiatives. Am I using the
Yes.
right word? Propositions, ballot propositions. What's your take on governing by proposition instead of having representatives do the work?
Well, we were talking about this at dinner, just before dinner, and was put in place, the idea that citizens could put propositions on the ballot as a sort of sign of direct democracy, but instead it's become dollar democracy, because it's whoever can pay people to collect signatures and get them on the ballot. And as many of you know, people will approach you with things that are very misleading, or at least what they say is very misleading, and you might even want to sign it, and then you find out that it's a very bad thing. So do I think it would be a better thing if our state assembly people and state senators did their job? Probably. Do I think it would be a better thing if we weren't subject to so many propositions, which I think also deters people from voting, because people feel like they don't quite know what they're deciding on. And in particular, this is really an interesting thing. A lot of immigrant voters don't vote because, who are naturalized citizens, but foreign born, because they think it's very important and they don't want to make a bad decision. And they feel like they're not informed. This apparently does not stop most US born voters, but it does stop a lot of naturalized voters. So I think it's confusing too. The question is, are you going to unilaterally disarm? That is, if you've got people who are collecting a lot of money and putting on really crazy propositions on the ballot, maybe you should put some good ones on. And I think that's kind of what's happened over the last 10 or so years.
So I asked this as an observation, not as an explanation for what's going on, but just a couple of examples. De-incarceration largely was motivated by a federal judge up in Oakland who said, you know what? There's overcrowding, and you've got to do something about it, and you've got to get rid of all these people. And this is all about the intersection of policy and the way things actually get done in society anymore. And then they rode that to 47, 57, these other ballot measures. Community colleges, when the recession hit in 2008, there were 2.6 million community college students. The recession is over. We now have 2.1 to almost 2.2 million community college students. We have a lot more people in the state who want to go to community colleges, but the truth is the state won't fund it. And we're not funding education that we need to, and yet they're saying, well, we can't afford it. And of course, then there's the income tax, or tax in general, and the way we do things, and how scary it is that a very few people actually fund most of our government. And I just, the overlay of those kinds of policy-rich issues are not, like I said, an explanation, but things that I wonder whether they need to be addressed in some way in order to make all of this work, which makes sense to me.
No, she raised a lot of really good issues, and they need to be addressed, but good ideas sometimes don't become policy, and bad ideas do. So to me, it's important to understand the underlying political calculus that's going on, and how do you change that? And I think you change that by mobilizing people to speak up. You have to do some education too. So for example, it's hard for someone like me, but you're absolutely right. Our state has a very progressive income tax. I support that for good reasons having to do with fairness, but it makes our revenue system very volatile. And so we need to be thinking about what property tax reform might look like, and actually what a sales tax on services would look like if we could try to make sure that it didn't have regressive impacts, right? So I think once we get that conversation going, some of the stuff can be possible. We really do need to make sure that we're engaging people civically. I do want to say one thing, because you brought it up, and because I know the board on what you said, and I know you didn't bring it up just because that, but I've got to say a good word about the community college system, which you're right is desperately underfunded, and is one of the major vehicles to get people to be able to integrate well into the economy and the kinds of jobs that working class and middle class people can get. And it's a way that people who are out in the labor force can come back in and retrain in certain kind of things and be able to shift with the changing economy. I have a special spot in my heart for community colleges because my dad went to LA Trade Tech, which is a community college in the heart of Los Angeles. And he was a guy with a 6th grade education who got accepted at LA Trade Tech to learn about electricity. And by learning about electricity, he went from being a janitor to being an air conditioner repairman, and the family went from being poor to being working class. The community college system is the central prop right now, I think, for so many people. And I frankly believe, and I know that we're moving in this direction, that community college should be free, and not just for the students who are coming out of high school, but for people who are re-entering into the labor force and looking for job training. And I said that, not you, so you didn't pitch for yourself.
Manuel, I want to ask the question I alerted you to during our podcast. Tomorrow night is the last night of our 4-week class on making California, creating it as a model to have a better in the Anthropocene. And so we've committed to developing a prescription of things we would change so it would be better for California and for Californians. What are the 3 things that you would include in a prescription for a better Anthropocene?
Kind of on the environment issue, or?
Anything. Housing, what 3 things do you think would make the biggest difference?
The first is to develop, instill, and constantly practice a sense of common destiny. If we saw ourselves in each other, we would not have allowed the level of incarceration and lack of forgiveness to take place. If we saw ourselves in each other, we would realize that there are kids going home every day scared that their parents might be deported and removed from them. We would see each other in each other, and we would think about how do we make sure when we raise the minimum wage that small businesses can survive through those changes, looking and seeing the other when we make that policy change, and looking, so that to me, restoring that sense of common destiny. And I think everything else really flows from that. Because once we do that, I think we have a real opportunity to see a big sense of common destiny with the planet and understand that the work that we're doing in California around climate and dealing with climate change, you can have so much of this in your new exhibit, renewable energy, dealing with water, et cetera, is about feeling a sense of commonality with the planet. The last thing I want to end on, and I don't know whether you're looking for something really specific, but this is as specific as I get. Not because, right? They say about economists, if you took all the economists in the world and you laid them end to end, they still couldn't reach a conclusion, right? So, but there's plenty of specifics in the book. We just did a thing for Orange County with a lot of specific policies. We did an equity profile for Long Beach. It's got a lot of specific policies to it. But what I really want to leave you with is something we talked about today in Orange County, which is that one of the biggest things that's prevented our sense of common destiny, and one of the reasons why it's so central in the book and talking about how California unraveled, is our sometimes lack of discussion around race and racism and the way it's been baked into the structure in our society. We don't talk about it enough. We don't try to repair it enough. I said today that it's a little bit like the following. How many of you go to the gym? Great. How many of you go to the gym like every once in a while? Okay. And when you go to the gym every once in a while, it really hurts. right? And you make mistakes. You drop weights on your feet. You use the machines the wrong way. You blurt out words like, oh, that you really shouldn't use in gym company. If you don't talk about race, racism, racial inequality, economic inequality every day, you'll be really bad at it. If you start to make it where we can have those conversations and you yourselves engage in those conversations, you'll find willing partners. People will allow you to make mistakes. Ever been in a gym and you're lifting weights the wrong way and somebody comes over and kindly corrects you rather than making fun of you? If you are doing this and practicing it, we can find our way to each other. And this is something we desperately need to practice for the country as a whole. The country is riven by these questions, refuses to admit to our history or our reality. We have a chance in California to do it right in our conversations, in our practices. And of course, the first step is reading this book, State of Resistance.
I highly recommend it, and there are copies. And Linda, are they in the bookstore? So, Manuel, thank you for a terrific lecture. And he didn't need a single PowerPoint slide. That's amazing. Yes, we come back here. Yeah. Larry, you don't get another question unless you buy a book.
Has an economist